you everyone for joining today. I spoke to Pablo and he invited me to talk to you about, I guess, some of the basics around triathlon nutrition, and then we can also obviously talk about what we've done with Pablo specifically, and then get into any individual questions that you might have either around your own fueling or what we do with Fuelin. So we'll go through some top mistakes that are made by triathletes, and not just triathletes, but endurance athletes in general. We'll talk about carbohydrates, and then we'll talk about hydration, and obviously leave that up to some open Q&A at the end. So I think in terms of like the most common mistakes we see with endurance athletes, or certainly triathletes, is these top six. So when we start at the top, when we look at, I think you've got to establish baselines. And what I mean by baselines is understanding where you are at the start of your journey. So something we did with Pablo was really just taking a step back before throwing a lot of things into the mix, is sort of understanding where he was at. So those baselines obviously come down from a subjective perspective, talking about, past medical history and understanding that, family history and whatnot. Eating behaviors is really important, but then also looking sort of, if you want to think under the bonnet. So blood tests can be very important for endurance athletes, as I was just talking about offline. Triathletes are more susceptible to certain deficiencies or insufficiencies. So something like iron deficiency, and understanding iron deficiency or iron deficiency anemia is super important for triathletes, and to ensure that you don't have that. Now, whether you're a female, certainly female, a menstruating female is going to be more at risk of iron deficiency, and certainly iron deficiency anemia, but males are also at risk. So you'll see numbers in the research, and certainly with elite triathletes, you'll have numbers of up to 35% of elite female triathletes will be iron deficient, with numbers around 15 to 20% of males being iron deficient. So that's something to consider. So blood testing, and we've obviously done a fair bit of blood testing with someone like Pablo, but we tend to recommend that for all athletes that come on the Fuelin program. So other markers that may be considered would be things like your vitamin D status, your red blood cell magnesium, looking at thyroid markers to ensure that you're not overtraining from that perspective. Other health markers might be things like HbA1c and your fasting blood glucose, looking at your lipid profiles, which are more health related, but certainly still relevant to you as an athlete. The other baselines you can look at is things like understanding body composition. So even though a lot of athletes will say they don't necessarily have a body composition goal, what we see on Fuelin is around 95% of athletes who come on the program will put their goal weight as slightly lower than their current weight. I think what's important from that is understanding, do you actually need to lose weight based on where you're currently at? So something like a DEXA scan can be very useful to understand sort of your subcutaneous fat, your visceral fat, so the fat in and around your organs, but also looking at your lean muscle mass, or your lean muscle mass index, and then looking at also your bone mineral density. So bone mineral density is super important, obviously, for the strength of your bones. Again, what we're seeing anecdotally with a lot of triathletes is on the program is that their bone mineral density isn't necessarily as good as what it should be. So we look at what's called a T-score. Any number that is less than -1 on a T-score is not optimal for you. Things that can improve your bone mineral density are things like optimal calcium intake through diet, optimal vitamin D status, and then weight-bearing exercise. So running is very important for bone mineral density, but also weight training or resistance training. And they're probably the key elements. And then on top of that is energy balance. So if you are in a negative energy balance chronically, under-consuming foods or fuel, low energy availability, red S, then that is going to leave you more at risk for low bone mineral density. You can do other baselines as well, things like VO2 max, assessing sort of your metabolic efficiency or flexibility, but probably those baseline measures I mentioned there are probably the key ones. Second most important point, I think, is not practicing carbohydrate intake, or at least avoiding carbohydrates. And it's something we've talked about a lot with Pablo, of improving his probably his thought process around carbohydrates and not being scared of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates ultimately are going to be your fuel choice, primary fuel for when you need to go fast. And certainly if you're looking to improve your race ability, then your ability to actually utilize carbohydrates, not just from a physiological standpoint in terms of like things like from your small intestine and gastric emptying, but also your ability to actually take on large amounts. And that is all going to come down to practicing that in training. Baseline measures also take into account things like your carbohydrate intake and also your sweat rate. So again, using Pablo as an example, him logging in his higher intensity sessions, Z3 or above, how many grams of carbohydrates is he taking in? What does that look like from a grams per hour perspective? Trying to push him up into sort of that 90 grams an hour, now upwards over 100, and then pushing towards that 120 grams an hour. Now, again, he is a professional triathlete. He is very fast, but it's not uncommon. And what we are seeing is more and more very good age group athletes improving performance through improving their total carbohydrate intake. Same for sweat rate, understanding how much you lose per hour in differing conditions. So hot versus cooler, on the bike versus the run. How much fluid do you need to take in to maintain a percentage of body weight loss? Little things like that can have a huge impact on your race day performance. The fourth mistake we see a lot is when athletes tend to focus on a single macro. So you'll often see with athletes that there is this high carb, sorry, I'll let this person in, this high carb, low fat, or high carb, low fat, or low carb, high fat sort of paradigm that people want to get into. Again, depending on where you sit is probably going to determine that. But then forgetting about protein being one of the very, very important macronutrients that endurance athletes often neglect. So regardless of what you do with fat or carbohydrates, protein should be consumed at a fairly moderate to fairly high amount, generally speaking, a minimum of at least 1.6 grams per kilo body weight. And certainly what we tend to push a lot more is certainly over 2 grams per kilo body weight. And that's not necessarily to increase lean muscle mass. It's probably as much as anything to maintain lean muscle mass, but also help with recovery, help with immune function, help with every other sort of bodily system that goes on. I think number 5 is not eating enough, and Pablo has been very open about sort of what he's gone through over the last 3 years. We did a video talking about that recently on our Instagram account, and he's not alone. Whether a male or a female, I think it's becoming much more prevalent, at least in social media, and athletes talking about perhaps not eating enough, not fueling for the work required. And when you can get that right, then things start to happen in a very positive direction. And then I think, points number 1 through to 5, ultimately that forms your race day plan. By practicing your carbohydrate intake in training, you build out what products you want to use, how much you can use, what you can tolerate, understanding your sweat rate, you build out your hydration plan, having your fueling around that before, after, practicing things like your race day breakfast. That will help build out what your race day plan is. If you're waiting until just before your race and then thinking, oh, I need to contact someone for a race day plan, and they give you a theoretical sort of, oh, you need to eat 100 grams of carbs for the bike, and you need to eat 90 grams of carbs for the run, but you haven't practiced any of that and it's completely hypotheticals, then you're probably not going to have the race that you deserve. So in terms of sweat rate testing, the screen on the right is something taken from Fuelin, from our what Pablo uses. I think in terms of sweat rate, and sweat rate testing and building out your hydration plan, treat it as guardrails. So nothing is an absolute. So even if you went and got tested and you went into a lab and they said you lose, 1.2 liters an hour, it's an estimate. Okay, you're going to have fluctuations, maybe between 1 to 1.3 liters per hour, but at least you've got an understanding of what you might lose in that particular temperature range. So as you can see here, the way that we split it is less than 85 Fahrenheit or less than 30 degrees Celsius versus over 85 or over 30. Do you work in Celsius, Pablo, or not?
Yeah, we work in Celsius.
You guys are metric, yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and there or thereabouts. Look, if it's 28 degrees Celsius, I would probably put it in the hot zone. Okay. Then you're looking at what zone are you actually working at in terms of intensity. Z1, Z2 is going to contribute to probably a lower sweat rate than when you're working hard, because sweat rate is going to be influenced by the amount of heat that you're producing within your body. That is why you sweat, to cool yourself down. What sort of duration are you going for? Is it a bike? Is it a run? Is it brick specific? What you then want to go down is actually, okay, what is your sweat rate? What is your average fluid intake? Then what does your average percentage of body weight loss look like? Do you get GI symptoms through that? And then looking at things like sodium intake. What's your sodium intake in terms of milligrams per hour and milligrams per liter? As you can see here, in terms of the fourth row down, we will provide a recommended fluid intake based on around 60 to 70% of your average sweat rate in that specific scenario. So in this case, it's a lower temperature run. It's a run, lower temperature, Z35 for this individual. And again, if you're in metric, we switch it to metric, but they would be taking in between 37 and 43 fluid ounces per hour. Okay. And that's a fair bit. Okay. But what you can see, that's the recommendation. If you see here, their average fluid intake is only around 13.7 fluid ounces. And that is resulting in a body weight loss of well over 2% body weight, with a peak percentage body weight loss of over 3%. And that's not going to help you when it comes to race performance. Okay. We know that levels above 2% is going to start to bring about physiological or detrimental effects to the physiological performance. Certainly levels when you're getting over 3-4%, it's going to start to have a significant impact. I think the biggest thing with sweat rate testing is that you need to do lots of them. Okay. So encourage, in terms of the way we work with athletes, is that we will always dictate or prescribe when you should be doing a sweat rate test, and then recording that in the app. Feel free, if you want to put questions in the chat as well, as we're talking about things, put them in the chat and then we can cover them at the end as well. I think it's getting much better in terms of carbohydrates, and athletes not necessarily fearing carbohydrates because of what's happening in social media, certainly because of the Norwegians and their emphasis on fueling appropriately. Companies like Precision Hydration, Morton, so on, pushing this higher carb fueling, and a lot of the research coming out about improvements in performance as a result of carbohydrates. I think that's really good. As it says, number one, this is your fuel for higher intensity efforts. And when I say higher intensity, if you are working over 60-65% of your VO2 max, or around 70-75% of your heart rate max, your primary fuel source is going to be carbohydrates. That, and when you actually break that down, 60-65% of VO2 max, it's not that hard. Like, you're actually not probably working as hard as what you think you should be in terms of burning carbs. But your primary fuel source, not necessarily completely carbs, but a predominant fuel source is going to be carbohydrates. And therefore, if you are taking on what we call exogenous or external carbohydrates in the form of either fluids, chews, or gels, then you are going to preferentially use that, offset the use of glycogen, stored muscle glycogen, and therefore prevent fatigue, or at least delay fatigue. I think a really easy way to think about carbs is, or taking in and probably taking in a large amounts of carbs as the source of fuel. Fuel is energy, energy is power, power is speed. speed is what every athlete wants. If you're moving along quickly, you're probably going to be passing people and you're going to be doing much better in the race. The other really cool thing about carbs is that it is trainable. Pablo will be the first to say that, like when you start off and you start trying to take in this huge amount of carbs, it is hard. And we're not saying you need to take in 120 grams an hour from word go. It's trainable. Women will tend to struggle with higher amounts of carbs more than men, probably just due to actual physiological differences between men and women. But women will experience more GI complaints than men. So start with lower amounts and then gradually build it up. You might be starting with 30 or 40 grams an hour and then building up beyond that and then gradually increasing based on GI complaints or GI signs and symptoms. But it is certainly trainable. We know that through the research. We also know it through anecdotal experience. So then when we come into carb capacity, again, these are 2 screens taken. So the idea here is you obviously consume all your products during training and then you log it. So, did you consume solid on the screen on the left? Did you consume solid carbs? So in this point, I think this is maybe one of my screens. It might be one of Pablo's. 122 grams of carbs, Cliff Blocks, a couple of endurance taps and a picky bar. Were any carbohydrates in the form of fluids consumed? No. Did they have any fullness? A little bit. Heaviness? A little bit. Any GI discomfort? Slight. Okay. And then it's important to document any comments related to that. The screen on the right, again, gives you an indication of how you're faring and what your average amounts are of carbohydrate intake versus your peak. So in this case, the average intake of carbohydrates from fluids and solids is around 54 grams per hour. Based on this individual athlete, we would say that is probably suboptimal for optimal performance. As a minimum, you're probably looking at least 60 grams an hour. And that's regardless of weight. We know that grams per hour based on kilograms is a nice starting point. And for women, you want to be going over 0.8 grams. For men, at least 1 gram per hour per kilo of body weight. Once you go beyond that, you're then starting to look at 60 grams an hour, upwards 70, 80, 90, all the way up to 120. And for some athletes, getting up into 140 grams an hour. And then breaking it down. Are you consuming most of your carbs in the form of solids, i.e. gels or chews, maybe a bar, or are you consuming it in fluids? It's all about logging your results, doing it repeatedly so that you get those physiological changes, but you also get those perception changes from the brain to the gut, and then doing it across a variety of sessions. The more you do, the more you understand, the better you get. Look, in that sense, it's very, very similar to just training. All you're doing is training nutrition, and it's that concept of training nutrition, much like you would be training on the bike or the run or the swim. So when we break it down, that's obviously talking about in-session sort of hydration management and carb session, but it is really important to think about what you eat before and also what you eat afterwards. So again, this is very non-specific, but at least gives you some takeaways that you can think about. How are you fueling? So anything less than 60 minutes for a run or a bike session, and also swims, you could probably consider, regardless of the intensity, either doing that fasted or having a small snack beforehand, something as simple as a piece of toast. I talk about this with Pablo a lot. Doesn't have to be fancy. It can be a piece of toast. It can be, what's that bread again?
Arepas?
Yeah, the arepas. Having something like that, it can be really, really, beneficial in terms of getting, maybe 20 grams of carbs, add a little bit of a jam to that or some almond butter. You're just boosting it up. Maybe it sits around 30 grams. Certainly as duration extends, so whether this is for bike or run, but if it's in Z1, Z2, somewhere between an hour and maybe 2.5 hours, eat something beforehand. It's going to benefit you, okay? Something in this case is something like overnight oats. It might have 30 or 40 grams of protein in it. It might have 10 to 15 grams of fat, and then it's got around 30 grams of carbs. That's going to help you, okay? It's going to get you through the session. It's going to allow you to recover better. It's going to just get you going better performance throughout that session and ultimately help you throughout the rest of the day. When we come into sort of the higher intensity, zone 3 or above, for a run, anything between 60 minutes and 2 hours, probably considering taking on a little bit more carbohydrates, maybe in the realm of, say, 50 grams, which is we use a traffic light system. Red is lower amounts of carbs, yellow is moderate, green is higher, moderate being around 50 grams of carbs in that sitting, higher being around 100 grams or above based on that meal color. Again, for the bike, you could push it out a little bit, but certainly taking on around that 50 grams of carbs beforehand in combination with some protein and some fat. And then I think anything where you're going over 2 hours on the run or at least 2.5 hours on the bike, fuel beforehand. You're going to feel much better. What you do on a daily basis in terms of your total caloric intake is going to have a far bigger impact, on body composition. It's going to have a bigger impact on your day-to-day feelings of well-being, and it's going to have a bigger impact on how you're performing in those sessions. So don't neglect what you do pre-session fueling or in-session fueling because you think you're trying to lose weight or improve fat oxidation or fat burning. What you do on the daily global basis is going to have a much bigger impact on that. So when it comes to in-session fueling, again, you can play around with this, but certainly zone 3 or above, carbs are your best friend. These are a few products that we would recommend. Things like Endurance Tap, Precision Hydration. Morton is on all the official Ironman courses, Cliff Blocks. You can also include fluids in there.
Never Second.
Sorry, Never Second's not in there. I need to update the slides. Never Second would be in there as well. And that's all, all these products actually, including Never Second. Even Scratch Labs, you can use that if you want as a fluid. Tailwind, if you really want to use that, although we find Tailwind tends to set off a lot of people's guts. Zone 1, Zone 2, these are a couple of products that you could use. Now, you can certainly use whole foods or homemade products for Zone 1, Zone 2 as well. So things like, some sandwiches, a wrapper with some jam or jelly or anything like that on it. Bananas, if you want to carry it, you can use that. And certainly pushing, practicing what you're going to use in a race, practicing that in training becomes very, very important. And then post-session, certainly super important, okay? Depending if you're in a performance standpoint or a weight gain perspective, or if you're in a body comp, is probably going to be influence a little bit what type of or the amount of carbohydrate you take on. Certainly, if you've got second sessions in the day, you're leaning towards yellow and green recovery meals to replenish glycogen. We know that if you consume carbohydrates, certainly within the first 2 hours following sessions, you're going to replenish glycogen at a faster rate than if you go beyond 2 hours. Probably within 60 minutes is optimal. You don't have to eat within 5 seconds of finishing a session. Same with getting protein in. If you are consuming either a protein shake or eating whole foods, you do have time to have a shower, relax, get yourself together, and then eat something. As long as it's within 60 minutes, you're fine. 60 minutes to 2 hours is sort of your window of opportunity to recover. So this is an example. Screens on the left is like the condensed view. The next screen along is the bigger view. So the way we do it is that we have this color coding system. You can see that every meal will also have the individual macro breakdown within it. So if this was a case for someone like Pablo, he's being recommended to have a high carb breakfast, which contains 50 grams of protein in it, 25 grams of fat, 100 grams of carbs. If he was to click on that cell, something like this, the overnight protein oats topped with fruit salad, served with 2 eggs and toast, could be an option for him to get in around 40 grams of protein, 20 grams of fat, and around 100 grams of carbs. It's not exactly what he needed to get, but it's very close. And at least he's getting close to what is required, and he can make up that remaining protein or fat throughout the rest of the day. He's then got a high intensity bike session. You can see here it's high intensity intervals. he's being recommended 70 to 100 grams of carbs per hour with the caloric breakdown, and 10 grams of fat. So that might be per hour. So that might be including a bar on the 60-minute mark every 60 minutes. He's then got to run off the bike. In this case, it's a lower amount of carbs for the run off the bike, signaled by the red mark. So that would be around 30 grams of carbs per hour, which would be 1 gel per hour. Afterwards, he's got a high carb lunch. Again, you can see fairly high amount of protein, 45 grams of protein, 25 grams of fat, 100 grams of carbs. That's to recover. The carbohydrates and the protein is there to allow him to recover. The fat is going to help with total caloric intake and just getting him through. The screen on the right is showing what type of products he could choose by just tapping on the lunch. So he could choose things like loaded mashed potato, lamb skewers, whole foods, real food, everything that applies to him. And this is what you'd see on a daily basis. So this sort of color coding with the training program built into that, because we do sync with like Training Peaks Today's Plan or Final Surge. I think the key takeaways from this is that high carb fueling works. It certainly improves performance. It doesn't mean that you have to use carbohydrates for every single session or high amounts of carbohydrates for every single session. As demonstrated, zone 1, zone 2 is going to be lower amounts of carbs, higher amounts of fat to provide you with the correct amount of calories, but also the correct amount of fuel based on the intensity. But higher carbohydrates, certainly when they're required, is going to result in higher performance. Don't be scared of fueling in session. As I mentioned, the way we structure it is that in-session fueling is actually kept separate from your day-to-day nutrition, so that you can just focus on eating really well during the day. And then when it comes to fueling the appropriate sessions, you've got a license to fuel. You just go for it. And, you know, Pablo will be the first to say it's actually quite liberating to know that, okay, I can eat 120 grams of carbs per hour and not even worry about how that's going to impact the rest of my day's fueling. And if you do have issues with higher carbohydrate fueling, just know that your gut is trainable. It's like a muscle, okay? First time you step in the gym, if you're doing squats, you may not do that well. You may only be able to do, 60 kilos or something like that. Over time, as you get stronger, that builds up 80 kilos, 100 kilos, 150 kilos on the squat rack. It's the same with your gut. You might start at 30 grams an hour, you build up to 60 grams an hour, then 90, then 120 grams, depending on your performance and depending on your ability. From a daily nutrition perspective, I think focus on the purpose. Is your purpose performance? If so, you need to be eating to fuel that. If it is on body composition, yes, you will be eating to apply a caloric deficit, but that deficit does not have to be so large that it actually impacts performance as well. Fuel for the work required. If you've got a lot of volume, if you've got a lot of load, then you need to eat for that. Otherwise, yes, in the short term, you may lose some weight, you may feel good. Probably after a week, certainly 2 weeks of a large caloric deficit, you're going to fall in a hole and it's going to have a lot of negative consequences. Plan ahead. It's all about planning, okay? The way you want to be thinking about it is someone like Pablo, who's your coach, is providing you with a structured training program. The way that Fuelin works is we provide you with a structured nutrition program. When you combine the two together, then you really have athlete empowerment and you actually start to see serious results as a consequence of that. So I sort of showed you some ways, some screenshots from Fuelin, but effectively what we are is a training-based nutrition app. So you have something like Training Peaks. You use Training Peaks, don't you, Pablo? Is it Training Peaks or Today's Plan?
Yeah, it's Training Peaks, yeah.
So we will sync directly with Training Peaks, and Training Peaks is providing you with your training program. We provide you with a nutrition program. As I said, the whole thing that we're doing is trying to remove that decision paralysis. So what to eat, when to eat, how much to eat. If we can do that and simplify that for you, we've done our job. The traffic light system is what we use to signify the amount of carbohydrates coming through. And ultimately, we are eliminating all that guesswork. Yes, you can question what we're doing, and Pablo does that a lot, which is good. But there's also that element of trust. Much like he's programming your training, we're programming the nutrition. It is completely personalized, okay? So no athlete is going to be getting the same nutrition program because it is going to be based on the training you're doing and then your individual biometrics. So things like your weight, your training volume, your day-to-day, what your purpose is in terms of, is it performance or is it body composition? All these different all these different metrics are going to have an influence on your personal program. And then, as I said, well, majority of triathletes are fairly data focused anyway. There is a lot of data that can be pulled through this. So things like your carbohydrate capacity, your sweat rate, your weight tracking, your macro tracking, everything like that can be done through the app as well. The way it works is that effectively you download Fuelin, you sync it with Training Peaks, and we talk you through that sort of 3-step process. You can measure and track as you want. If you really want to track, we do sync with MyFitnessPal and Lose It, or you can track within Fuelin. There's lots of recipes and ingredients within that. You can track your sweat rate testing, you can track your carb testing, and certainly you can track your body weight. I think one of the best things that we do, though, is very much focused on athlete education. So you'll see on like our Instagram account as well that we are very focused on education and making sure that we are providing information about performance nutrition based on scientific principles. Every week we do a Q&A session, which goes for between 45 minutes and 60 minutes. This week's Q&A, which is generally held on a Thursday. This week's Q&A is on bicarb soda and beta-alanine, and talking about its use with triathletes and whether or not you should be using it or not. So they're generally, you can have a look on our YouTube channel as well. I think there's about 75 videos there. They're fairly long. As I said, they're all about an hour, but they are fairly informative and hopefully very educational for you. We did launch a new program. So originally the program was always $100 US, 200 or above that, depending on the level of coaching. But for the pilot program, which still provides you with everything I've talked about today, if you sign on for an annual program, it is as low as $29 a month. If you don't go on the annual program, it is $39 a month. But for Pablo's team as well, what we'll do, we'll set up a discount code so that you can get 20% off that amount. So that's something that we tend to do with athletes as well from teams. That's the email address. You can also email me directly with Scott@Fuelin should you have any questions. But what we will do is go into any questions you may have.
I think there are a couple in the chat. There are a couple in the chat, and then we can go to others.
Yep.
I have one, Scott. Hi, how are you?
Oh, hi. Who's talking? Can everyone put their cameras on? It's so much nicer talking to a camera.
Sorry.
Oh, that's cool.
I mean, for women, it's very tricky, like eating a lot of carbs, because we are like women are very tricky to eat a lot of carbs because you also are like taking into account many things. But how you can know you are eating enough carbs per day, or even before or after each workout? I mean, the pre-meal and post-workout meal. How do you can just measure the amount of carbs or the ideally for your performance?
Yeah, I think, look, there's a lot of factors that come into that based on what you're trying to achieve as well. If you're a female who's trying to lose weight or improve body composition, then ultimately you have to be in a caloric deficit. Generally, the easiest way to manipulate total calories in or out is by adjusting carbohydrate intake.
Okay.
If you're not in that case and it's about high performance, then you're probably going to be taking on a minimum of probably around 3 grams per kilo of body weight over the course of the day. Now, again, depending on the type of session you've done is going to probably dictate the amount of carbohydrates that you might need post-session. So, look, at a minimum, the total amount of carbohydrates you take across the day is going to probably be just as important as what you take on immediately following a session. Obviously, taking on carbohydrates, as I said, within sort of 60 minutes is going to help with glycogen replenishment. So if you do have a secondary session on that day, then certainly consuming carbohydrates within 60 minutes of that session finishing is going to be very important. And then probably continuing to eat probably every, at least for the next 3 to 4 hours to continue to replenish glycogen to allow you to do that. If you've got a session the following day, it's probably all right. Like, you're not going to fully replenish glycogen stores depending on whether or not you did fully glycogen depleting exercise as well. And I think that's the other thing that gets lost is like, people look at the science and they're like, oh, I've got to eat, 2.5 grams of carbs or 3 grams of carbs per kilo body weight post 1 hour of training. And it's like, that is a huge amount of carbohydrates if you're going to be doing that. And so I don't necessarily agree with that, because like, you're not doing glycogen depleting sessions all the time. Like, sometimes it might be a Z2 session that goes for 2 hours, but because you've also eaten during that session, you're not in a huge caloric deficit. So then it's about balancing that. So look, it is, if general rule, if you were trying to improve body composition, you would probably say somewhere between like the amount of protein you're taking and the amount of carbs being fairly similar in terms of parity.
Which I'm going to interject. Sorry, none of my female athletes that are in this call are improving.
They're all just trying to maintain and perform.
They're all like if I hear one of them saying that they need to improve body composition, we need to have a little chat. But I think they're fairly high performance.
Okay, so Paola, like for you, your total amount that we're probably going to be giving you on a daily basis would be a minimum of sort of like 4.5 to 5 grams per kilo body weight of carbs.
A lot.
Well, it's not really, though. But it's not really. Like, and you got to remember, carbs aren't just, and this is something I've spoken to Pablo about, carbs aren't just pasta. It's not just rice.
No, fruits or cereal.
It's vegetables. It's vegetables, it's fruits. Like, don't be afraid of eating it, though, because you're burning it.
Like, I'm not even achieving the at least the half of carbs per day. I mean, very bad.
and so you then come back to how do you know if you're eating enough? Like, if training is erratic, if what you're doing in training is erratic and you're not consistent with training, you're not eating enough. As a woman, if you've lost your cycle, if your cycle is not regular, you're not eating enough. If you're not sleeping well, you're not eating enough. If you've got sweats at night, you're certainly not eating enough. If your bone mineral density is not optimal, you're not eating enough. If you're irritable, now everyone gets irritable, I get that. If you're angry and like annoyed all the time, you're probably not eating enough. Like, if you can't concentrate at work, if you're falling asleep during the day, you're not eating enough. Like, there's all those sorts of signs that if your hair is brittle, if your hair's falling out, you're not eating enough. Like, and that's specific to a female, but like, if any of that is resonating with you, then you're probably not eating enough.
And I have another question regarding that. Is I don't know where I read it, but it says that swimming consumes more carbs than running or than doing a bike, because your muscles or something like that.
Did you say that again, that you use more carbs in swimming?
Yeah, I mean, the days that you swim, you should eat more carbs than the day you don't swim. Or, I mean, on some article, I read that in the past. If that's true, first, and the second is we should plan our nutrition day or our nutrition meals according each one of the trainings. I mean, if it's intensity.
Let's start with the first question. Go with the first question first.
Okay.
We'll go to the next one. So it won't necessarily like, if you look at swimming intensity and heart rate, your heart rate's probably very low. Yeah, when you're swimming. So again, fuel substrate utilization or fuel choice by the body is going to be dictated by intensity and duration. If you're working at a low heart rate, you're not burning carbohydrates in the pool. You're probably burning fat predominantly, but total calorie expenditure in the water will go up. So if you're in the water for 60 minutes, you're resting, your metabolic rate can increase by 300 to 400% for at least 60 minutes after that session. So this is why, so in Fuelin, if you've got a swim session, we'll never we won't let you go into that swim session fasted. So if you're going, you swim in the morning, yeah?
Yeah.
How often do you eat before swimming? Never. And this is the thing. Yeah, but I'll say never because you balked at it. But like eating a piece of toast, a single piece of toast with some almond butter and some jelly or peanut butter, like it'll be a game changer for you. It'll be a game changer for you. Have a boiled egg with that. Suddenly you got 15 grams of protein, 10 grams of fat, and you got 30 grams of carbs. Your swim session will be that much better. It will be so much better. You'll come out of it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not because I swam at 5 a.m. So
that's all right.
Egg at 4:30, you will be.
Yeah, but whilst you get out of bed, you put the toast in the toaster, you get your swimming costume on, you've got some pre-boiled eggs in the fridge that are already peeled. You eat one of those whilst you put your swimmers on and your tracksuit or whatever. Your toast pops up, you put the peanut butter on, you grab it, you walk out, you're in the car, you go. You eat it in your car. Like, it's not hard, but everyone will have these like, oh, I can't do it, it's too early. No, just be organized.
Okay.
But yeah, I think, so that's that. So caloric expenditure will be higher in the water, definitely. So you do, again, if it's a swim session over 60 minutes, I'd probably encourage to have like a banana poolside or some fluid carbs and things like that as well to consume, maybe 30 grams for that hour or whatever. It will help. And then your second question was what?
Regarding the intensity. I mean, you should plan your nutrition according to the intensity or just the duration of the training.
Are you talking about in-session fueling or are you talking about pre and post session?
Excuse me?
In-session fueling or pre or post session fueling?
Pre or post. I mean, during, I know I have to eat, but post. So, I mean, also post the post workout, because the pre will be like an oats or something, but the post workout will be the same amount of carbs if it's just I don't know, aerobic session or intensity session.
Well, it's do you remember that I showed you a slide with the post session fueling? So depending on what you did beforehand, like if you did like a fairly moderate, if it was a zone 1, zone 2, and again you're not in a body composition, you'd probably be taking in a minimum of 50 grams an hour, 50 grams of carbs in that post session fuel with, you know, the appropriate amount of protein. Again, depending, looking at your body mass, you're probably aiming hopefully for somewhere like 120, 130 grams of protein per day. I don't know if you're consuming anywhere near that amount of protein. I'm probably guessing no. Yeah, but that will have a huge impact on recovery as well. You know, if you're getting in, say, 30 grams of somewhere, probably for you look quite small, but you're, you know, somewhere in that 25 to 30 grams of protein per feed, post and pre is going to help you a lot.
Okay. I have to eat more. That's the message.
You do have to eat.
Okay. Thank you, Scott.
Cool. Louis asked, should be 10 kilos less than their height. I haven't heard this one. It's so what if you're 170 centimeters? Is that
he's saying that
he's
170? Yeah, he's saying he's 170 centimeters. That he should be 60 kilos.
Is that based on
no, kgs?
Myth. I think it's a myth.
170 is what, divided by 2.2. So that's 85.
No, Scott, he's 170 centimeters. So 1 meter and 70 centimeters.
So why is it 60? Just the 0.7. So 10,
0.7. Yeah.
Okay. I've never heard that. I think that's just a little one of these wives' tale sort of things. I think base it on what you actually are. So get a DEXA scan and work out if you're carrying, 25 kilos of body fat and you're, whatever, like work with metrics that are real is what I would say rather than, do that. That's what I'd say. Are you 1.7 and 60 kilos, Louis?
He's a little bit above 60 kilos right now. And we talked about this, and we talked that let's focus on performance before we focus on weight. So
yeah, I do that. And look, often when you get your fueling in and around better, you start performing better. So then caloric expenditure goes up in the sessions anyway, and you end up stripping some body fat anyway and losing a little bit of weight. Like your caloric deficit doesn't have to be huge in order to lose weight. I think, again, that's where athletes get it wrong. They're like, I've got to be in a caloric deficit in order to lose weight. So therefore I'm only going to eat 1,000 calories. And it's like, yeah, you're going to drop weight, but you're going to die really quickly. Like you're just going to be like dying in training a week after. Whereas if that caloric deficit was only say 100 or 200 calories, it will be a slower drop, but it's going to be sustainable.
And I think, Scott, you and I have found out that, and most of my athletes that are in this call, I think right now are they live at altitude, and we have come to realize that it does put an extra stress in your body that it's very hard to quantify. And so when we play with that deficit, it can be very dangerous here. And so we just have to be extra careful, I feel like. And same with Maria's question that I think you're going to answer soon.
Yeah, I'll answer that next. But and on that, and I've been guilty of this as well. Like you think the weight is going to fly off when you're trying to lose weight. Like you're looking at the scale and like, why aren't I a kilo lighter this week? Like that's a lot of weight. Like you should be happy if based on trends, like 100, 200 grams a week is absolutely fine. If you're losing, say, 0.5 kilo a week, that's a lot, okay? Like, don't expect 1 kilo drops per week. Because if you're dropping 1 kilo a week, and which it's like a lot of people want this, but in the sport like Ironman and triathlon, like it's too much. It's got to be very small and very sustained. That's a really important point to take away. And don't get frustrated. Like, if you want to lose weight, don't do triathlon. Like, literally. Like you could improve body composition. You could do all that just through lifting weights in the gym, doing some high intensity interval training. But you're in this sport because you love triathlon. Focus on loving the sport and doing it really well. Everything else tends to look after itself. Don't focus on necessarily losing weight. I think it's like something that people can fall into badly. Maria, do we recommend fasting for women? Not really. No, generally. I don't really recommend it for any athletes, to be fair. In season, you don't want to be fasting. Look, you could consider an overnight fast if you want, like eating dinner in the evening, sleeping through the night. And then if the session in the morning is less than 60 minutes, yes, you could do that session having not eaten. But as I said, I think it was Paola, we were talking like if it's a swim session, don't do it fasted. You'll just feel terrible. If it's a run, easy bike, yes, you could do it without eating if that's your personal preference, but eat after the session. Don't wait until 12 o'clock in the afternoon before you eat your first meal because you're going to be in a catabolic state. You'll then lose lean muscle mass. You increase inflammatory markers. You're reducing you're increasing negative effects on bone mineral markers. As a female, something as small. So if you don't eat any carbohydrates after a session of 60 minutes or significant intensity, that's going to have negative impact on bone mineral markers. So you'll increase bone catabolism and you will reduce the ability for these bone markers to actually lay down bone. And that's been shown in the research really late. So if you want to have a detrimental effect on your bones, then don't consume carbohydrates after training. And I think that's again another really important reason why you should be eating carbs not just from a high performance perspective, but from a health perspective.
Scott, and sorry there, because I think there is also a point where people, like, you think you're doing things right, and so they say like, okay, I'm gonna do the fasted training, but then they forget that second aspect that is super important, which is eating right, like eating after that session, right?
After
like
the session,
because they get busy, they do this or that, and then it's 3 hours later and they haven't eaten. And so if that's the case, I will not risk it. Just and that's my opinion as a coach. And it's like, why will you risk it like that?
So I'll tell you, there's even cooler research more recently. So if you really want to do fasted training and you want to do that, then eat your meal in the morning about 10 minutes before you start the training. And effectively for the next 45 to 60 minutes, you're still in a fasted state, relatively speaking. You will still have the same levels of fat oxidation as someone who does it without eating, which is super cool. So you can actually eat, you can feel good about eating. Don't feel bad that you're blunting, your ability to burn fat. And that meal effectively becomes like a recovery meal. And then you eat after the session as well. And then you're doubling up on recovery. So if you really want to go down that route, you can sort of do it that way. I tend to eat very close. Like I did a 2-hour ride this morning. I ate 10 minutes before I got on the bike. I had overnight oats. It had 50 grams of protein in it. It had about 20 grams of fat, and I had 50 grams of carbs. I ate that, but it's 2-hour ride. By about an hour in, okay, it probably was kicking in. I then actually still ate a picky bar at 60 minutes because I was like, you know what? I know that I've got to keep my calories up because I'm not trying to lose weight. I just want to feel really good on this ride. The other guys on the ride hadn't eaten anything for breakfast beforehand. They weren't eating anything on the ride. Where were they? They were miles behind. And it's like, think about why you're doing things as opposed, like always think why. Why am I doing this? And if you can ask yourself that question and answer it truthfully, then you're in a good position.
Scott, I have one question from an athlete that couldn't be here, and maybe like the last one, because I know we're running out of time. Carb loading. He asked me about carb loading and what do we think about carb loading. We used to hear stories of people just stuffing their face with a lot of pasta and things like that. What would you recommend as general guidelines for the days before, like let's say 2-3 days before a marathon, a half Ironman, an Olympic distance race? I mean, some people love to eat all the pizza, but like, what would you recommend?
Sorry, I'm just going to message this. It's a coach. I'm just going to message the coach quickly. Sorry. It's probably a much more in-depth, but you, as a female or male, you want to be taking on at least 24 to 48 hours beforehand, a minimum of 8 grams per kilo body weight. Absolute minimum of 8 grams per kilo body weight. That can be a combination of generally lower fiber foods. Generally processed or ultra processed is easier because of the total quantity. Keep FODMAPs. So FODMAPs are types of carbohydrates that can cause sort of some GI complaints. Generally keep those low. Combinations of rice, pasta, breads, fluids, lollies, things like that. You're generally going to restrict things like vegetables. You can include fruit for the fructose, and eat it throughout the day. It's not just the meal in the evening. It's certainly, as you've seen, morning, lots, and it's generally eating in sort of 100 grams of carbs sort of quantities as you go through to allow you to get that 8 grams per kilo body weight. You certainly need to practice it prior to doing it before a race because it's hard. Like I had to try and eat, I can't remember what I was trying to eat the other day, like, 700 grams of carbs. And like, I didn't get there. I couldn't get there. And so I was like, shit, I need to plan this out better to make sure that by the evening, I'm not like having to eat 300 grams of carbs because it's impossible. Rice bubbles are very good. Rice Krispies, they're very good. So big bang for buck. Cereals, breakfast cereals that you wouldn't normally eat, Cocoa Pops, things like that. Like, it's cool. White breads.
I eat bread rolls. I eat bread rolls all day. So I eat like a packet
soak them in water. Soak them in water like the hot dog eating champions, like things like that. It makes it easy. So
Okay. Well,
little things like that. But we could do a whole session on carb loading. If they want to have a read about, I read an article for Triathlete magazine on carb loading specifically. If they just search that on the internet, they can find that. And there's heaps of articles on our website as well about all that stuff. So, guys, I've got to run and eat pizza. Yes, absolutely. Pizza's great. Yeah, probably a marinara. Not too much pepperoni and that on it, but yeah, like a pizza base is fine. Again, it's white bread effectively. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that as well. Don't be afraid of that stuff. Cool, guys. Yeah, look, you've got my email address, Pablo. Obviously, you can forward on anything from me. Please stay at the end of this. There's usually a questionnaire. Just fill it in, please, just to let me know what you thought of the session and things you might be interested in for the future, and we can go from there.
Thank you for everything, Scott. And yeah, guys, you can reach out to me, and I can send stuff to Scott if you have any questions. Thank you for the time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Scott.
No worries.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.